Your soulmate says, "I need to tell you what happened today. Please open this. My beloved child." Your soulmate has something on their mind tonight that they've been struggling to put into words. Earlier today, something happened that caught them completely off guard, and ever since then, they've been replaying the moment in their head. They almost reached out immediately. They opened your conversation, stared at your name, typed something, erased it, and put their phone down. Then they picked it up again. Because what happened today didn't just remind them of you, it forced them to face something they've been trying very hard to avoid. There was a moment when they suddenly realized that the distance between you isn't protecting either of you anymore. And the strangest part? Someone or something around them said something that made your soulmate think of you instantly. They couldn't explain why it affected them so deeply. But it did. Don't skip, because there's a detail about today they haven't told anyone else. At some point, your soulmate found themselves alone with their thoughts, and that's when the emotions became impossible to ignore. They remembered a conversation between you that seemed ordinary at the time, but today, those words sounded completely different in their mind. They realized you may have been trying to tell them something without directly saying it. And suddenly, they wondered whether they had misunderstood your silence, your distance, or even the way you looked at them the last time you were together. Then came the moment that truly shook them. They discovered something, small on the surface, but powerful enough to change how they viewed the entire situation. It made them ask themselves one painful question: what if I waited too long? That question stayed with them all day. They wanted to be brave enough to tell you everything, but fear kept getting in the way. And yet, tonight, something inside them feels different. There's a reason the words, "I need to tell you what happened today," feel so important. They aren't simply trying to give you an update about their day. They're trying to explain a moment that changed something inside them. Your soulmate has been carrying a truth they didn't know how to approach, and today gave them a reason to finally consider revealing it. They may still hesitate. They may still wonder how you'll react. But the decision is becoming harder to postpone. Something huge is waiting for you, because the next thing they want to tell you is connected to a choice they made today, and that choice could completely change what happens between you from this point forward. Stay till the end, because there is one final detail about today that your soulmate never expected to discover, and it has everything to do with you. Something happened after that moment that made your soulmate stop pretending they were unaffected. They received a message, heard a familiar name, or crossed paths with something that unexpectedly brought you back into their thoughts. At first, they tried to brush it aside, but then a strange realization hit them. They weren't simply missing you, they were afraid of losing the chance to make things right. They started thinking about everything they never said, especially the words they swallowed when they had the perfect opportunity to be honest. And then they remembered a specific moment between you that they had never fully understood. Suddenly, it seemed like your silence had been saying more than your words ever could. Your soulmate began wondering whether you had already made a decision about the future. That thought unsettled them. Because if you had decided to move forward without them, they knew they might have no one to blame but themselves. But the biggest surprise came when your soulmate realized what today's events were actually forcing them to confront. They had been telling themselves that they needed more time, more certainty, more courage. Yet today, something made that excuse feel impossible to continue. They understood that waiting wasn't making the situation safer, it was slowly creating a distance that might become impossible to cross. For a while, they simply sat there, thinking about you and imagining what would happen if they finally told you the truth. Would you believe them? Would you forgive them? Would you still feel the same way? Those questions frightened them because your answer suddenly mattered more than their pride. And that's when they made a quiet decision. They didn't send the message yet. Instead, they began writing exactly what they wanted to say, carefully choosing every word because there was one confession they knew could change everything. And here's where today becomes even more meaningful. While your soulmate was trying to understand their own feelings, they noticed a sign that made them pause. It wasn't something dramatic. It was something ordinary that somehow felt deeply personal, a reminder of a promise, a place, a memory, or words only the two of you would truly understand. They took it as a reason to stop running from the conversation they had been avoiding. For the first time, they weren't asking, "Should I tell them?" They were asking, "How do I tell them without losing them?" That shift matters. Because your soulmate is no longer standing at the beginning of this realization. They're already moving toward a confession. And there's one sentence they've been rehearsing in their head over and over tonight, one sentence that begins with the real reason they were so shaken by what happened today. The sentence they kept rehearsing wasn't complicated, but it carried more emotion than they expected. "I should have told you sooner." Those words kept returning because your soulmate finally understood that the problem wasn't that they had nothing to say. It was that they had been afraid of what telling you the truth might change. Today forced that fear into the open. They began remembering every moment when they almost confessed, every time they wanted to reach out but convinced themselves that silence was easier. But silence didn't make the feelings disappear. It only gave them more time to grow. And as the evening continued, your soulmate started imagining your reaction. They pictured you reading their message, pausing for a moment, wondering why they were suddenly being so honest. That thought made their heart race. Because they knew this conversation couldn't be casual anymore. Something real had reached a point where pretending was no longer possible. Then came the memory they had been avoiding the most. It was a moment when you may have thought they didn't care, when their behavior seemed distant or confusing. But now they were looking at that memory from a completely different perspective. They realized you probably saw only the outside of what they were going through. You couldn't see the fear behind their silence. You couldn't hear the conversations they were having with themselves late at night. And perhaps that's what hurt them most. They wondered whether you had mistaken their hesitation for rejection. They wondered whether you had quietly accepted that they didn't feel the same way. That possibility made them realize something painful. You could be protecting your heart from a story that was never actually true. Don't skip, because this is where your soulmate's thoughts shifted from remembering the past to deciding what they're going to do next. For the first time today, they started thinking beyond the confession itself. They started thinking about what would happen after they finally told you everything. Would they ask for another chance? Would they explain what really happened? Would they finally admit why they pulled away when their feelings were becoming stronger? The answers were frightening, but there was one thing they knew for certain: they didn't want another day to pass with you believing the wrong story about them. So they made a decision that surprised even them. Before the night was over, they were going to prepare the message. Not necessarily send it immediately, but prepare every word they had been too afraid to say. And hidden inside that message is something you probably never expected your soulmate to admit, because it reveals exactly what happened today when they realized they might actually lose you. Tonight, your soulmate finally reached the moment they had been avoiding. They opened their phone again and began typing, but this time they didn't erase the message. They started with the truth they had been carrying for far too long: you don't know what happened today. Then they stopped. They stared at those words because suddenly they realized the story wasn't really about what happened around them. It was about what happened inside them. Something shifted when they realized that you might genuinely be moving forward without waiting for them. They imagined your life continuing, your attention going elsewhere, and your heart becoming less available to the connection they had taken for granted. That thought created a kind of urgency they couldn't ignore. For the first time, they understood that your patience was not something they could assume would last forever. Then they remembered the exact moment today when that fear became real. It may have been something someone said, something they saw, or a simple situation that suddenly made them realize how much your absence had changed their world. They tried to act normal, but inside, they were unsettled. They wanted to call you. They wanted to hear your voice. More than anything, they wanted one chance to explain why they had acted the way they did. But there was another emotion underneath all of it: regret. They regretted the times they stayed quiet when honesty could have brought you closer. They regretted allowing misunderstandings to grow. And they especially regretted one decision they made because they thought they were protecting themselves. Now they were beginning to see that decision may have hurt you instead. Stay till the end, because the next revelation explains why they suddenly became so afraid of losing you. And then came the realization that changed the message completely. Your soulmate understood that they weren't just afraid of losing your presence, they were afraid of losing the possibility of a future with you. That distinction hit them hard. They had spent so much time analyzing the past that they almost forgot the future was still being written. So they added another sentence to the message: I need you to hear this from me before you hear it from anyone else. Then they paused again. Why would they need to say that? What could have happened today that made them feel you deserved to hear the truth directly? Their fingers hovered over the screen, because they knew the next words could reveal something they had deliberately kept hidden. And once they typed them, there would be no easy way to take them back. The words finally appeared on the screen, and your soulmate stared at them for several seconds before continuing. Someone asked me about you today. That simple sentence carried far more weight than it seemed to. They hadn't expected the question, and they definitely hadn't expected how quickly their emotions would surface. They tried to answer casually, but their reaction gave them away. Suddenly, they realized just how deeply your name was still connected to everything they felt. The person asking may not have known the whole story, but your soulmate knew. They knew there were unfinished conversations, unanswered questions, and feelings they had never properly explained. And when they were asked whether you were still important to them, they couldn't give the easy answer they had prepared in their mind. They hesitated. That hesitation revealed something they had been trying to hide, even from themselves. Afterward, they kept thinking about why they couldn't simply say they had moved on. That question followed them everywhere. They replayed the conversation while driving, walking, working, and even when they were supposed to be relaxing. Eventually, they realized the truth was uncomfortable but undeniable. They still cared more than they had admitted. But there was another detail they hadn't expected. The person who asked about you mentioned something that made your soulmate wonder whether you might already know more than they thought. That possibility immediately changed their mood. They started questioning what you had been told, who might have spoken to you, and whether a misunderstanding had quietly grown between you. Suddenly, the message they were writing became less about explaining their feelings and more about making sure you heard the truth directly from them. Don't skip, because this is where their fear becomes much more personal. Your soulmate then deleted several lines and started over. This time, they didn't want to sound dramatic. They wanted to sound honest. They wanted you to understand that today wasn't just another ordinary day that reminded them of you. Today exposed something they could no longer deny. They realized that every time they tried to imagine a future without you, their mind kept returning to the same question: what if I had been brave enough sooner? That question hurt because they knew they couldn't change yesterday. But they could change what they did next. So they made a quiet promise to themselves to stop hiding behind uncertainty and finally tell you what was really happening inside their heart. Yet just before they could finish the message, something unexpected happened on their phone, and what they saw made them wonder whether you were about to make the first move instead. The moment your soulmate saw what appeared on their screen, everything inside them went still. It wasn't the message they had been waiting for, and it wasn't the simple sign they expected to see. It was a reminder connected to you, something they had almost forgotten existed. For a few seconds, they didn't move. They simply stared at it, wondering why it had appeared at that exact moment. Then a thought hit them: maybe this was the reason today had felt so different. Maybe everything that happened was forcing them to stop avoiding the conversation they had postponed for so long. They opened your contact again, read the last conversation between you, and noticed something they had overlooked before. A sentence. A pause. A subtle change in your tone. Suddenly, they wondered if you had already sensed what they were hiding. And that possibility made them nervous, because now they had to face the one question they had been avoiding: what if you already knew? Your soulmate began going back through the events of today, almost like they were searching for a missing piece. They remembered the person who asked about you. They remembered the unexpected reminder. They remembered the feeling that came over them when they realized your place in their life wasn't as easy to replace as they had pretended. But then another memory surfaced, one involving a moment when they had promised themselves they would eventually explain everything. They had never forgotten that promise. They had simply kept pushing it into the future. Today, that future suddenly felt much closer. They realized that if they waited again, they might lose the courage they had finally found. So they began typing the message from the beginning, this time without protecting their pride. I need to tell you what happened today. They paused after those words, because they knew the next sentence would reveal the part they had been most afraid to admit. Stay till the end, because this is where the truth becomes impossible to hide. Then they finally typed it. When they asked me about you, I realized I still talk about you in my head like you're already part of my future. Your soulmate read that sentence again and again. It frightened them because it was more honest than anything they had said in a long time. They weren't claiming to have every answer. They weren't pretending the past had never happened. They were simply admitting that despite everything, their feelings had survived the distance, the confusion, and the silence. But there was still one final piece missing from the message. The part about what happened immediately after they realized this. Because after writing those words, your soulmate received another unexpected piece of information, something that made them sit back, take a breath, and whisper your name. And what they discovered next may explain why they were so desperate to tell you about today in the first place. The information your soulmate received next changed the entire emotional weight of the day. It wasn't something loud or dramatic. It was one small detail that suddenly connected everything they had been feeling. They learned that you may have been facing your own decision about the connection, whether to keep waiting for clarity or finally protect your heart and move forward. That possibility hit them harder than they expected. They realized they had been thinking about their own fear while never fully considering what their silence might have been doing to you. And suddenly, the message on their screen no longer felt like something they could postpone. They understood why they kept hearing your name in their thoughts all day. They understood why memories kept appearing at unexpected moments. Their heart was warning them that the window for honesty might not stay open forever. So they looked at the message one more time and decided they were finished hiding behind uncertainty. They began typing again, slower this time, because every sentence felt important. I need you to know that what you thought was rejection wasn't the truth. They stopped there for a moment, knowing those words could reopen an old wound. Then they continued. They explained that some of their distance came from fear, confusion, and circumstances they didn't know how to communicate at the time. They admitted that they had watched opportunities pass because they were waiting to feel completely certain. But today taught them something painful. Sometimes certainty only comes after you finally take the risk of being honest. They weren't asking you to forget the past. They weren't demanding an immediate answer. They simply wanted you to know what had been happening behind the silence. And as they reached the final lines, their hands actually paused over the screen, because there was one confession left, the one they knew could change the way you understood everything that came before. Finally, they wrote the sentence they had been too afraid to say. The truth is, I wasn't scared because I didn't feel enough. I was scared because I felt more than I knew how to handle. They read it once. Then again. And for the first time, they didn't delete it. They understood that whatever happened next, they couldn't keep pretending the connection meant nothing. Today had forced them to confront the feelings they had buried, the regret they had carried, and the possibility that you might no longer be waiting. So they prepared to send the message that began with those unforgettable words, I need to tell you what happened today, but before they pressed send, they added one final line. Something so personal that they almost couldn't believe they were typing it. And that final line revealed exactly what they had been hoping for all along, the one thing they never had the courage to ask you directly.